With the Liberal Party leadership election concluding this weekend, selecting the person who will be Canada's Prime Minister for the briefest of times before the general election, it seemed the moment to come to this story. When Donald Trump first announced that he would impose crippling 25% tariffs on former ally Canada and blamed it on fentanyl coming across the border, it left most people bemused as well as alarmed, because really not very much fentanyl comes across the Canadian-US border. When President Trump derided Canada's Prime Minister as being the governor of the 51st state of America, people took it as Trump doing what Trump does, outraging people to dominate the news cycle, denigrating people to demonstrate power over them. But when Justin Trudeau made a statement the day that Trump imposed the tariffs, Trudeau said something that most people didn't focus on, because rather a lot was going on. Trudeau said that what Trump wanted to achieve with his tariffs was, quote, a total collapse of the Canadian economy because that'll make it easier to annex us. Trudeau himself had started thinking that Trump's lines were jokes and insults, but after conversations with the president, he had come to realise that he was completely serious. Trump and Trudeau spoke twice by phone on February the 3rd. Details of these conversations, along with subsequent discussions between US and Canadian officials, were shared with the New York Times by 4 people with first-hand knowledge on condition of anonymity. Trump had listed a long string of grievances he had on trade between the two countries, but then he moved on to another tack. He told Prime Minister Trudeau that he didn't believe that the treaty that demarcates the border between the United States and Canada was valid, and he said he wanted to revise the boundary. Through history and across the world, nations have ended up in extremely hostile situations, fighting over contested borders. So this isn't a by-the-by sort of claim to throw casually into a discussion. The border treaty in question is from 1908. It finalised the line between the then British Dominion of Canada and the United States. Trump also said that he wanted to revisit the agreement on how lakes and rivers are shared between the two countries, which has been governed by a number of different treaties. You could still dismiss that as part of the bluster. Largely, that's what Trudeau reportedly did. The sense that this was more serious came when there was a call between the US Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick and Canadian Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc. Lutnick called LeBlanc after the February the 3rd calls between the leaders and told him that Trump had come to realise that the relationship between the US and Canada was governed by a number of agreements and treaties that were easy to abandon. And Trump, said Lutnick, was interested in doing just that. Obviously, we've seen before Trump's casual disregard for historic treaties, but the idea you just turn aside the treaties that demarcate national boundaries, and that could just be slicked past and the target nation would just shrug and say, you got us. It is mind-blowing. Once you've adapted your understanding of reality to see that as the mission, a number of other things start to make sense that previously did not. He's reviewing military cooperation between the two countries, particularly NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. You may know them as the people who track the progress of Santa Claus every Christmas, but I'm here to tell you that's not their principal job. And then you add on to all that the tariffs, the push to renegotiate the management of the Great Lakes. All of it seems compatible with ratcheting up the pressure and the misery on the country to make acquiescing to Trump's demands the easier way out. In an economic summit, Trudeau got caught on a hot mic talking about the situation after journalists had been ushered out the room, not realising his words were still being broadcast where they could hear them. He said this, I suggest that not only does the Trump administration know how many critical minerals we have, but that may even be why they keep talking about absorbing us and making us the 51st state. They're very aware of our resources, of what we have, and they very much want to be able to benefit from those. But Mr. Trump has it in mind that one of the easiest ways of doing that is absorbing our country, and it is a real thing. Gary Sands of the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers, who was in the hall at the time, told the Toronto Star, "When the PM made that comment, you could have heard a pin drop." With all that being the case, it shouldn't be a surprise that when the Canadian government added $200 million to fight organised crime and fentanyl smuggling, didn't make the difference to the Trump tariff game. While all of this is in the public domain, there is still a significant mismatch between how people see this. As Beth Burke, the head of the Canadian American Business Council, said to the Toronto Star, most Americans don't believe Trump is serious about his annexation threats, but see them as a negotiating strategy. The key as to why Canadians are so furious and so resistant to everything that's now going on is that they are only too aware of some of these details that make it seem like a very clear and present danger. Right now, other nations are not being vocal about defending Canada. So long as the US grabbing the territory of other countries remains just talk, they are taking the route that by treating it as not serious, they somehow might influence the reality, in the same way that pretending NATO is still fully functional might somehow make it so. So treating the 51st state jibe as just an insult helps to keep the illusion of normality just a little bit longer. You might also suggest it's a sign of initial cowardice. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, for instance, declined to speak up for Canada in a press conference with Trump when he was in Washington, D.C. Now, it does not mean that Britain wouldn't stand by Canada if the threats turned into action. You have to bear in mind the dynamics of these press conferences where the mainstream media, especially the British press, do this. They ask questions designed to encourage some degree of division or blow-up between the two leaders present. Because if there's a sore point, an area of contention, a veiled weakness, they will zero in on it like sharks scenting blood.
For the Prime Minister, did you discuss with President Trump his repeated statements of desire to annex Canada? And has the King expressed any concern over the President's apparent desire to remove one of his realms from his control?
They're incentivized to do it because if a politician in question slips up, says something indiscreet, then it can turn into a massive headline for them. And they don't much care about the fact it might do damage to the interests of the nation in so doing. So Keir Starmer was there trying to manage the Trump beast, not to get bitten, to present the UK as the reliable ally. He won't have seen that moment as the right one to torpedo the relationship at the prompting of a journalist.
You mentioned Canada. I think you're trying to find a divide between us that doesn't exist.
Nevertheless, right now you can excuse Canadians for wondering as they process the changes this will mean, as they see the damage to their country that the tariffs are wreaking, for wondering whether they stand alone. They almost certainly won't. But right now the whole world is in denial, trying not to speed up the process of everything going to hell with all the systems that became highly integrated with the United States over the last decades. All of which will be one of the added challenges for the next Prime Minister of Canada and for the nation generally, as it tries to navigate just how to manage a crisis that could quite literally threaten its survival as a separate nation.